Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mario Cristobal, the Miami Hurricanes working their way through fall camp, and a few storylines have emerged over the first couple of practices that I want to dive into. And this is my favorite part about fall camp, where you kind of get a feel for how these position battles might shake out, what players are going to emerge as difference makers for this Miami Hurricanes program. Now, look, you make no mistake about it. Mario Cristobal is one of those head coaches who's a little bit close to the vest in terms of depth chart conversations, injury conversations. That being said, over the last couple of practices, you're starting to hear some guys emerge. I want to highlight some guys that are emerging for this Miami Hurricanes program, talk about, what it means for this Miami Hurricanes team heading into 2024. Fired up to get into it. Before we do it, as always, just a massive shout out to the Miami Hurricane fans. It has been a blast talking this program, whether we're talking the recruiting trail, whether we're talking the transfer portal. The amount of support y'all continue to show, it truly does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. I think much more importantly, look, I know all of you guys are reading the fall camp notes just as I am. I would love to hear what storylines are kind of sticking out to you guys as well in the comment section. We'll chop it up down there. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with at least what was probably the biggest storyline that has emerged during this first week, that is, that's Damari Brown kind of moving around from the boundary cornerback spot to that nickel role. And I think this is where the addition of Michelle Powell means so much to this Miami Hurricanes defense, where you have a guy in Michelle Powell. We went all the way back to when he committed to Miami and said he gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to get this secondary to look and how you can get your best 5-6 players out on the football field in that defensive back room. And so if Damari Brown does in fact kick down to that nickel spot, a guy that I would think at least you want on the football field pretty consistently, you can throw Michelle Powell into that safety spot. You go back to his time at Washington, played all over the defensive backfield. He gives you that kind of flexibility. So I think the question is, if Damari Brown's coming to the nickel, which we think he can be a dang good nickel cornerback, we know Michelle Powell can be a quality safety, what's the conversation we're having with the other boundary cornerback spot? And I think a couple different names emerge. One, Jadias Richard. This is a guy that I am certainly keeping my eyes on in fall camp, a guy that I think is extremely talented, came over from Vanderbilt last year, length, he's a smooth mover. Can he put it together going into year 3? That's the question mark. And then you have a guy in Deani Hill coming over from Marshall that kind of gives you that high floor. But I think what the Miami Hurricanes are trying to do, at least in this defensive back room, is, hey, if we have some question marks about the safety position, why don't we just kick Michelle Powell back into one of those safety roles and just, again, continue to work on getting our best 5-6 players on the football field in that defensive back room? And when you have that kind of chess piece with Michelle Powell, who, again, can play all over the defensive backfield, it really does allow you to get your best football players on the field. So Damari Brown kicking a nickel, maybe seeing Michelle Powell work a little bit more as a safety, is probably the biggest storyline that we've seen emerge. And I think now our next question is, all right, who's going to win that cornerback spot opposite Daryl Porter Jr. out on the boundary? I think the second biggest storyline, and I think one of the biggest storylines outside of Cam Ward on this football team, is how good this defensive line can be. Now, you look at this Miami Hurricanes defense, you make no mistake about it. You look at the secondary and say, all right, that's a unit that we might have some question marks about. How can we mitigate some of the question marks we have about the secondary? It's by having an elite defensive line. You look at the defensive line, couple of guys popping out during the first week of fall camp. One, Simeon Barrow Jr. Massive storyline. I think Simeon Barrow Jr. can be one of the most disruptive interior defensive linemen that we see in all of college football, and quite frankly, can play the similar role that Leonard Taylor played for Miami in 2023, but just on a little bit more consistent basis. You go back to Leonard Taylor, you saw some reps in some games where he was a game wrecker, and then there were other games on the film where he was non-existent. I mean, Simeon Barrow Jr. sounds to have come in, has taken a leadership role on the defensive line, has lived up to what we think his talent level is. That's a massive storyline. Now, I think the second guy we're taking a look at is Akeem Mesidor. This was a player that we just highlighted a couple of weeks ago in terms of, nobody's really talking about him. A lot of the conversations go to Simeon Barrow Jr., Ruben Bain 2 years ago in 2022. Akeem Mesidor was probably the best defensive lineman on this Miami Hurricanes team. If we can get back that form of Akeem Mesidor in 2024, it's just another body that you can do so many different things with. Akeem Mesidor is a guy that can rush off the edge, but you can also put him in that 3-tech and have just a disruptor on the inside of the defensive line. Now, early reports of fall camp say Akeem Mesidor looking the part like he was in 2022. That's a massive story. And I think the last storyline is Anthony Campbell. And he's going into his 6th year at the college football landscape. Came over from Louisiana last year. Didn't get to see a ton of him in 2023. Sounds like he might be a guy that kind of works his way into the rotation on the inside of the defensive line. They want another big body like Anthony Campbell to emerge. Because you look at some of the guys, Simeon Barrow Jr., he's 6'3", 285. You look at Marley Cook, he's not over 300 pounds either. They have some really good interior defensive linemen, but maybe a little bit undersized. If you can get Anthony Campbell to kind of emerge as another big body rotational piece on the inside, I think that's a massive storyline. And then Justin Scott. From the reports that I've read about Justin Scott, and again, the pads aren't on yet, so it's kind of hard to gauge the physicality, but from the pure looks of things, it's going to be hard to get Justin Scott or keep Justin Scott off the football field as a true freshman in the 2024 season. I look at the defensive line and say, man, it almost reminds you of some of those elite SEC programs. And I think I've said this before for the Miami Hurricanes, but it kind of reminds me of the conversations that Kirby Smart had around the Georgia defense in 2022, where he had some concerns about the secondary, but it didn't really matter because that front seven was so dominant. If you are looking to take a little bit of pressure off that secondary, if you can win on first and second down, then have an elite pass rush on third down, that's the best way. I wouldn't say to cover up for a secondary, but to help a secondary out that's young and might need some time to kind of get into the groove of things during the 2024 season. I think monitoring the boundary cornerback position, that's something we're looking at. And then looking at how good can this defensive line be in 2024. Now you go to the offensive side of the football. I think the biggest storyline I want to talk about, and a guy that I think a lot of Miami fans were excited about, and then the excitement kind of died down once Sam Brown came in, is Isaiah Horton. Another guy that's only going into year 3 within this program. Miami was looking for a big body that could stretch the football field in this wide receiver room. You have guys like Jacoby George and Xavier Restrepo where, hey, we know what those wide receivers are. I've been very vocal that I think Xavier Restrepo is really going to be one of the better wide receivers that we see in the country. But you look at Xavier Restrepo, he's much more of a short, intermediate route tree kind of guy. You look at Jacoby George, much more of a yards after the catch guy. What wide receiver is going to come in and be that elite boundary wide receiver that can work vertically down the field, not only create some of those explosive plays, but manufacture a little bit more space for some of the wide receivers like Restrepo and Jacoby George? Isaiah Horton continues to impress. He had a really good spring. He seems to have continued that going into fall camp. I truly think you might have a little bit of a position battle going on between Sam Brown and Isaiah Horton, both of which I'd expect to play a decent amount of football, and I expect to play a lot of football in 2024. But to hear that not only Sam Brown is looking good, but Isaiah Horton is continuing the momentum that he had during the spring, that's a massive story because, again, that's the kind of wide receiver we are looking for to kind of step up and break out within this Miami Hurricanes offense. Cam Ward wants to push the ball down the field. If Isaiah Horton or Sam Brown can be that target for Cam Ward, that takes this Miami Hurricanes offense to another level. And I think the last thing you got to talk about is the offensive line position battle where, hey, we look at this Hurricanes offensive line. One, it's really deep, but more importantly, there are 4 spots on the offensive line that you just feel so confident in, right? Starting at the right side, Francis Maui-Noah, Nez Cooper, that is a very good right side of the offensive line. It's anchored by Zach Carpenter, who's played a ton of football at the Big Ten level, and then Jalen Rivers at left tackle. Now, I think the one position battle that we are looking at is, all right, who's going to be that starting left guard? You got some really, really good options, right? Matthew McCoy, Tommy Kinsler, Pancake Honcho. It sounds like Samson Okunlola is probably the guy as of right now to play that left guard spot. But if you're a Miami Hurricanes fan, I think you just feel really comfortable that whoever wins that battle, whether it's Tommy Kinsler, whether it's Matthew McCoy, whether it's Samson Okunlola, they're probably going to be a very good starting guard for this Miami Hurricanes program. And so I look at the offensive line and say, Miami's feeling good. We're just monitoring that left guard spot. And I think the last thing we got to talk about is the tight end spot. This was the position that we talked about extensively during the offseason. Two things that were notable. One, Miami didn't go to the transfer portal to add a tight end. I think that tells us that Miami believes in the tight ends that they have in the room, where you look at a lot of other positions, they were not shy. It's probably the best term to use in terms of going out and making this roster better at almost every single position. At the tight end spot, I don't even know if Miami was even looking for a tight end. Now, some of the storylines were here and out of that position. One, Elijah Arroyo, he seems to look like he used to. And again, when Elijah Arroyo went down with that injury, I feel like we've never gotten that same version of Elijah Arroyo. If he can be that guy for this Miami Hurricanes team in 2024, I think that's a big storyline, because Miami's going to want to use that tight end position. They're going to want to run the football. A lot of tight ends are going to play for this Hurricanes team. If you can get some of these tight ends to become difference makers in the passing attack, that's another element that I think brings this Miami Hurricanes offense kind of up another level. Now, I think the fascinating conversation is Elijah Arroyo is not the only guy that we have our eyes on, a guy that we want to see get back to kind of that form we saw prior to the injury. You have a guy like Riley Williams, who's only going into his second year, that certainly looks the part from a run blocker standpoint, but a guy that certainly can work that middle of the field and be a little bit more of that matchup nightmare at the tight end spot. You have Cam McCormick, who we know what he's going to do, just be a run blocker. You also have Elijah Lofton, who, again, going back to the spring, it sounds like Elijah Lofton is going to get on the field. Now the question mark is, how are we going to get Elijah Lofton on the field? He's not necessarily the biggest tight end, but going back to how we talked about him coming out of Bishop Gorman, we know he's a very willing run blocker. And so I think that's the other thing that we're looking at for Elijah Lofton, is how does Miami decide to get him involved in this offense? Because what we heard coming out of spring, he's probably going to be just a hard guy to keep off the field for this Miami Hurricanes program. Those are the big storylines that I have coming out right now. Again, Miami hasn't even put on the pads yet. So once they put on the pads and once the bullets start getting a little bit more real, so to speak, we'll have a little bit more to talk about in terms of how that position battle is shaking out. We'll continue to keep you guys updated, continue to talk about this program. Again, appreciate y'all rocking with the fellas. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.